Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Dr. Shana Weiss. I am the Associate Director here at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. I am thrilled to have Michal Raucher here with us today. Before I introduce Michal, I want to remind us that we are in a meeting format, so reminder to keep yourself muted. Please put all questions in the chat. And while we're started, feel free to also type in just where you're tuning in from. We love seeing where everyone is coming from. So without further ado, Michal Raucher is an assistant professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers. Her research lies at the intersection of Israel studies, religious ethics, Jewish studies, and the anthropology of women and gender. And she does work on how Jewish women in the US and Israel push boundaries, reinforce norms, and construct moral worlds. Dr. Raucher conducted ethnographic research on the ethics of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jewish women in Israel. She interviewed women in their homes in Jerusalem and spoke with them about their reproductive lives. Her book, which is based on this research, and she'll be sharing part of that research with us today, is called Conceiving Agency, Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. And she is now, and you should buy it. It's amazing and great. She's currently now working on the ordination of women in Orthodox Judaism in Israel and America. And I see several of those women in the chat, so I'm thrilled to have them here today. She has published on all sorts of issues: embodiment, orthodoxy and gender, Judaism, abortion, religion and bioethics. She has won dozens of awards. Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, Fulbright, Crown, I can't even, sort of name them all. But I'm thrilled to have her with us today. She got a PhD in religious studies from Northwestern, and she also got her certificate in gender studies, and is also a personal friend, which is really lovely when that happens. So without further ado, I hand it to you, Dr. Raucher.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Shana Weiss, for that wonderful introduction. It's so great to be here with you, to be here with the Schusterman Center. I'm honored to be invited and to share some of my work here today. It's also great to see where everybody's from. Wow, we were talking just before everybody came in about how, there is something nice and intimate about sitting around a table together, something that we all miss. And yet it is lovely that there are people here who otherwise wouldn't be part of this conversation if we were just sitting around a small table together. So it's so wonderful. I love it. Keep it coming in the chat. I'm so excited. And it's great to see people who I've known for 20 years, people who I'm, just meeting now. So I'm excited. I'm going to try to make my remarks concise so that we can have more of a conversation at the end. But I am going to, okay, let's see. So I'm going to share some slides that my slides are mostly visual aids so that you don't just stare at my face the whole time. And any kind of longer quotes I put on my slides so that I often find it hard to stay focused on a longer quote. So hopefully this helps. Okay, so I want to tell you about, I'm going to start by telling you about Devorah, who was one of the women who I spoke to a number of times during her pregnancies. 4 weeks from her due date for her fourth child, Devorah's fetal ultrasound revealed that the fetus's head was not head down, but rather in a breech position. Her doctor told her that there was a chance the fetus would flip again before labor, but that at this point there was a higher chance of a C-section because he would not deliver a baby who was in a breech position. As we talked about Devorah's desire to avoid a C-section, she remembered a skula she had once heard about flipping a fetus in utero. A skula refers to a taboo, a folk practice, or a protective ritual. We briskly walked back to her apartment. The front door of her apartment opened into the living room, where a dilapidated couch sat against the wall on the right-hand side of the room. Her living room was sparsely decorated. Immediately in front of us as we entered her apartment, though, was an entire wall of bookshelves, filled with Sfarim, sacred books. Devorah started scanning the bookshelves in her living room. Gleefully, she pulled a few books off the shelves and turned them around so that they were standing up straight. I'm just going to demonstrate using my book, which you should all buy. Okay, so the books were like this, upside down, and she turned them around so they were standing up straight. With each flipped book, she whispered a prayer, asking God to hear her request. According to the Segula, if the Sfarim in one's house are upside down, flipping them could flip the fetus into the right position. This was the ritual she remembered, and she hoped that by turning the books in her house, she could turn the fetus in her uterus as well. Women told me about other skulot that echo a similar relationship between books and babies. When a woman is in the 9th month of pregnancy, her husband is given the honor of opening the ark containing the Torah scrolls during morning prayers. This action is a skula meant to ensure a woman's womb begins to open for an easy delivery. Waiting until his wife is in the 9th month of pregnancy to ask him to open the ark, the congregation makes it clear that they do not want the delivery to come earlier than the 9th month. In this skula, the ark parallels the womb, and the Torah scrolls inside the ark are like the fetus inside the womb. Judaism's most holy books, the Torah, are seen as being aligned with a fetus. Here, a pregnant woman's husband is granted the ability to not only protect the fetus from an early delivery, but to actually begin the process of labor for his wife. Although the origin of these skulot is not clear, we can see that they establish a relationship between holy books and babies. In these skulot, the directionality flows from books to babies. What men do with the books or what women do with their husbands' books will affect the fetus in some way. This relationship, can you guys see my slides okay? Can I get like a thumbs up? Yeah, great, okay. This relationship speaks to the role of books in Haredi life. Haredi Judaism is often referred to as a book tradition, a phrase that highlights both men's participation in yeshiva study or book learning and the primacy of book knowledge or halacha. Each yeshiva is a little different, following its own traditions and approaches to Judaism, but the centrality of books is universal. Although the yeshivot are generally lacking significant decoration, Sfarim are found all over the place. Many of the books found in a yeshiva are volumes of the Babylonian Talmud and codes of Jewish law, but one can also find prayer books, books on moral guidance, and Bibles. Before an individual puts a book back on the shelf, or if he drops it accidentally, he kisses the book. Samuel Heilman, who's one of the largest sociologists of Haredi Jews, explains, it's in this sense that one may consider these books not just items of study, but objects of reverence, icons of the yeshiva. Discursively, books and the rabbinic authority that books uphold are of supreme importance for many Haredim. Just like the directionality of the skulot described, books are meant to direct and instruct one's life as a Haredi Jew. The rabbinic discussions and laws found within the books are meant to be authoritative, presenting readers with normative guidelines for living a Jewish life. Having many books in your home, therefore, symbolizes your adherence to these codes. All of the Haredi homes that I entered looked similar to Devorah's. Decorations were sparse, furniture was worn, toys were strewn about the house, and bookshelves were overflowing with books on rabbinic law. They were placed in the main room of the house. A house with a lot of books conveys to visitors that the men within the home have devoted considerable time to learning the contents of these books. This is a marker of status for a Haredi family. Now, although Haredi women have never been exposed to the same kind of rigorous and advanced study of religious texts, they are expected to support their husband's studies and maintain the same level of conformity to Haredi rabbinic authority and respect for yeshiva education. Women are tasked with raising children who exist at the center of Haredi life. While their husbands contribute to the maintenance of Haredi Judaism through their study of rabbinic texts, women enable the future of Haredi Judaism through reproduction and child rearing. Haredi women have a fertility rate that hovers between 6 and 8 children per woman. A woman's religious identity is tied to her reproductive abilities and her parenting of these future Haredi Jews. Babies are markers of status in a similar way that books exist as markers of status. In public, a Haredi woman pushing a stroller or leading a family of children has achieved the status of a good Haredi woman who is contributing to the future of Haredi Judaism. Yet, there is another impulse among the Haredi women I interviewed. Haredi norms have cultivated the expectation that women should ask their rabbi before using birth control, getting an ultrasound, or going in for a C-section. However, after 2 or 3 pregnancies, Haredi women express agency to make reproductive decisions without rabbinic involvement. When it comes to reproductive decisions, Haredi women instead draw on their embodied experiences of pregnancy, their cultural norms surrounding reproduction, and the theological beliefs regarding their relationship to God during pregnancy. They make decisions that they know are contrary to rabbinic expectations, or they make decisions independent of rabbinic consultation. And they base those decisions on their prior reproductive experiences. Haredi women who spoke to me explained that books and rabbis were not relevant to their embodied reproductive lives. Now, this type of decision-making might seem like Haredi women completely reject the structure of Haredi life, a structure that has put sacred books and rabbinic authority ahead of personal preference. However, there are a few important things to note. 1, Haredi life has actually been changing significantly over the last couple of decades. Fewer men study in yeshiva or kollel full-time, and more women pursue advanced education and careers outside of the Haredi sphere. Despite the importance of rabbinic authority, there are currently many other types of authority to which Haredi Jews in Israel respond. In other words, book culture is not really an accurate way to describe the entirety of Haredi society anymore, if it ever was. And 2, the authority and autonomy with which Haredi women are making reproductive decisions is actually embedded within the structures of Haredi life. Haredi women express agency as a result of their participation in the gendered norms of Haredi Judaism. This is similar to the way scholars of conservative Christian women and Muslim women speak of women creatively conforming to religious norms in order to exert their agency. So in our time together, I want to demonstrate how women use the discourse of book culture while subverting the authority structure contained within it. We're going to look at Haredi pregnancy advice books and some of the data I collected during 2 years of interviews with Haredi women in Jerusalem to explore how Haredi women use pregnancy advice books to cultivate their authority over reproduction. When they do so, they occupy both the male book sphere of authority as well as the female pregnancy sphere of authority. Books and babies, as I said, are each markers of status in the Haredi world. And when women display their books about pregnancy, they earn this kind of doubled status. By displaying pregnancy advice books on her bookshelves alongside her husband's Sfarim, a woman proclaims her homage to books and the significance of books in the Haredi world. Additionally, because they're books about pregnancy, in displaying the books, women are publicly declaring that they have children and are committed to the centrality of children in the Haredi world, in much the same way that a woman pushing a stroller down the street publicly demonstrates her commitment. This demonstration, however, is done in the way men exhibit their commitment to the norms of Haredi life, through acquiring and showing off their books and respecting rabbinic authority. In this way, a Haredi woman's ownership and display of pregnancy advice books is both subverting her gendered role in the community and reinforcing it simultaneously. Her display of pregnancy advice books suggests that her reproductive authority exists on the same level as rabbinic authority. What we'll also see is that women acquire this level of authority as they gain reproductive literacy, or the experience in reproduction. This expertise is gained not through books or studying, but the embodied experience of pregnancy. As many women told me about the decisions they made without consulting their rabbis, they explained something like this: I have been pregnant 3, 4, 5 times, but my rabbi has never been pregnant. Haredi women deny their rabbi's authority over her reproductive life. This embodied understanding of authority comes out of the fact that a Haredi woman's religious identity is tied to her reproductive abilities and her parenting of future Haredi Jews. This concept of reproductive literacy builds on Sally Hahn's term prenatal literacy, or the ability to read, understand, and apply all the pregnancy signs and symptoms, tests, and ultrasounds. Hahn is a medical anthropologist. And this book is from 2015, something like this, 2015-ish. Hahn argues that as women gain prenatal literacy, they can better understand and interpret both their experiences of pregnancy and the medical information they receive. Initially, Haredi women used pregnancy advice books to help them gain this kind of prenatal literacy. These books provide medical and religious answers for various prenatal questions. Should I fast for Yom Kippur? How many ultrasounds should I get? When should my first ultrasound be? What's the progress of fetal development? All these kinds of questions that a pregnant woman learns throughout the course of her pregnancy. After her second pregnancy, however, a Haredi woman's literacy shifts. Reproductive literacy speaks to a woman's advanced experience with pregnancy, wherein she learns from her own embodied experiences for authority. She's no longer willing to turn to rabbis who have never themselves been pregnant, or books which represent the world of the rabbis. Women with reproductive literacy make their own medical and religious decisions about contraception, prenatal testing, ultrasounds, and birth. Reproductive literacy is the ability to read their embodied experiences and consider those experiences as granting them religious authority. So I'm gonna introduce you to some of these pregnancy advice books in a moment. We're gonna explore some of the common themes contained within the books. And you'll see how women's understanding of pregnancy and reproductive decisions reflects the content of these books. And yet, here's what kind of baffled me. When I asked women what they learned from these books, they couldn't remember anything in particular. The content of the books seems to have played very little role in cultivating their reproductive literacy, despite the fact that this is to a great extent the goal of the books. Towards the end, I'm going to explore why I think that is. Why read these books, display them prominently, and then deny their influence on your life. So here are the two books. These are the pictures. When I visited Haredi women in their homes, they showed me these two pregnancy advice books that sat on their bookshelves. B'shat Tova, Madrich Refui Hilchati Leherayon V'Leida, In a Good Time, a medical and halachic guide for pregnancy and labor, and Hachana Ruchanit L'Leida, the spiritual preparation for labor. Some women removed these books from their shelves to show me. As I held them in my hands, I noticed the differences between these books and all the other books displayed on their shelves. The majority of books on their shelves have black or brown covers with gold writing indicating their contents. These other books belonged primarily to their husbands, who had spent hours poring over the content. Amidst dozens, if not hundreds, of books on rabbinic literature and sacred text, women kept these two pregnancy books. B'shat Tova and Hachana Ruchanit both have colorful colors. One even has this picture of the baby slippers. Now, aside from some prayer books and perhaps a copy of the Hebrew Bible, these pregnancy and labor advice books were women's contribution to scholarship in their homes. B'shat Tova, a medical and halachic guide for pregnancy and labor, was co-written by a nurse midwife, Michal Finkelstein, and her husband, Rabbi Baruch Finkelstein. The book was first written in English in 1993, as the Finkelsteins are American by origin, and then translated into Hebrew in 1996. The Finkelsteins released a revised and expanded version in English in 2001 and Hebrew in 2002. The women I spoke to had the more recent Hebrew version, so that's the one that I'm quoting from here. The book was published by Feldheim Publishers, which is a large publishing house in Jerusalem and New York. B'shat Tova is a phrase congratulating someone upon hearing, is a phrase usually used when congratulating someone upon hearing of her pregnancy. It means in a good time or in a good hour, meaning that the birth should come at the right time. The pregnancy advice book structures itself as a medical book about pregnancy and a religious book about pregnancy. The second book, Hachana Ruchanit, is an anthology of writings primarily by women about labor and delivery. Another married couple, Moshe and Daphna Chastai, edited and published this anthology. And although there's no publication date in the book, Daphna Chastai remembers publishing it in the late 1990s. The anthology contains a collection of short Hebrew essays from rabbis, rabbis' wives, and doulas, who I'm happy to talk about the role of doulas in Q&A if anybody's curious. It's a book of religious instructions and inspiration about pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. One of the messages featured prominently in B'Shat Tovah is that a woman has to incorporate and learn how to balance rabbinic and medical instructions during pregnancy. The book contains certifications from prominent Haredi rabbis in the front of the first couple of pages, alongside certifications from doctors, illustrating their equal standing in the book. This book also provides both medical and religious information about fetal development, telling women that information from rabbis and doctors can be consistent. Throughout the book, the Finkelsteins remind their readers that rabbis want them to visit doctors and utilize modern medicine to take care of themselves and their growing fetuses. This messaging intends to solidify a place for both doctors and rabbis in a woman's prenatal care. The Finkelsteins reject the exclusion of either doctors or rabbis. They explain, we found that the two extreme attitudes towards medicine are not correct. The one who relies on a miracle to protect his health is considered a fool. Those who think that their health is entirely in the hands of modern medicine and not in heaven's hands are considered to be non-believers. We are required to find the golden path that merges one's faith, bitachon, with one's effort, hishtadlut. When the Finkelsteins mention faith and efforts, what they mean is that a person should incorporate both religious and medical instructions. Women who walk this golden path are those who consult doctors and rabbis and work in a kind of triadic relationship with both for their reproductive care. In Hachana Ruchanit L'Leida, Nurit Glazer shares a similar message. Many times when a woman arrives in the labor and delivery room and they give her a gown and they measure her blood pressure, everything they need to do, she enters into an entirely different world. She forgets that she also has her own considerations and she has a role in the matter. Suddenly, she's just a minor part of the play. She forgets that she has the right to say no sometimes or to bring her own opinion and request something. Now, when Glazer mentions a woman's opinions or her own considerations, she's speaking about religious obligations. Glazer continues by explaining that religious women often feel that the secular medical system is antagonistic toward their needs. But if a woman asks nicely, she can get what she needs from the doctors. For example, a religious woman who enters the hospital might be concerned about covering herself modestly. Glazer wants religious women to learn how to ask for a blanket instead of being embarrassed in the hospital gown. Glazer, like the Finkelsteins, intends to teach women that their religious needs and their medical needs can be met simultaneously, and that doctors and rabbis can help produce healthy babies. During their first pregnancies, I found that women turned to these books a great deal, internalizing their messages about the need to adhere to religious and medical instruction. I met Dahlia when she was pregnant with her fourth child. She showed me the pregnancy books on her bookshelves, but she told me she hadn't looked at them since her first pregnancy. Dahlia grew up Haredi and became a dancer, already a very unusual career for a Haredi woman. Soon after getting married, she opened a dance studio for Haredi girls, and she feared that getting pregnant would interrupt her ability to dance. Afraid to discuss birth control with her husband or rabbi because she knew they would oppose it, Dahlia got pregnant in the first few months of marriage. During this first pregnancy, Dahlia's husband and rabbi expressed their concern about her dancing. Although they had no medical expertise, they were afraid that dancing would threaten the pregnancy. Now, obeying rabbinic authority, she followed his instruction and stopped dancing for the duration of her first pregnancy. For Dahlia and other Haredi women, conforming to religious and medical demands continued into their second pregnancies, despite some internal questioning. Because of some light bleeding at the beginning of her second pregnancy, the doctor instructed Dahlia to go on bed rest for a few weeks. Dahlia challenged this restriction. She told me, I did have thoughts of, what do I need this for? It's not like I'm committed to babies. If not this one, another one will come. She admitted that she would not have had an abortion, but her thoughts and feelings indicate that Dahlia was beginning to express her own desires in this pregnancy, as opposed to the first. Nevertheless, Dahlia listened to the medical and religious instruction that she ceased dancing during her pregnancies. The pregnancy advice books that Dahlia read during her first pregnancy had taught her that these two epistemological realms work in tandem to produce healthy babies. So Dahlia heeded this advice. As women like Dahlia followed these instructions for their first and second pregnancies, They were both respecting the reverence for books and the message that the books contained. They accepted the idea that rabbis and doctors that were sanctioned by rabbis should guide their pregnancies because this was consistent with the general respect for books and book knowledge as that which should control bodies. Now, something happens later on in their reproductive lives. In later pregnancies, women express a relationship between doctors, rabbis, and their own preferences that challenges the norm for religious authority in Haredi life. Instead of relying on books and those who are literate in rabbinic texts to determine the best course of action when it comes to reproductive decisions, Haredi women draw on their reproductive literacy. Haredi discourse understands women's bodies to connect them to God during pregnancy. This idea is contained within the pregnancy advice books that women read during their first pregnancies. Although they reject the book's insistence on consulting rabbis and doctors for pregnancy guidance, women continue to support the idea that pregnancy connects them to God. This is because this direct connection to God allows women to bypass the rabbis who otherwise serve as intermediaries between the Haredi public and divine will. The embodied experience of pregnancy distinguishes women from the rabbis who might otherwise guide their decisions. Haredi rabbis, all men, will never be pregnant. They therefore will never have reproductive literacy. One can find these ideas about a pregnant woman's direct connection to God within the pregnancy advice book, Spiritual Preparation for Labor, Hachana Ruchani L'Leida. In Nurit Glazer's essay, she writes, labor is a woman's opportunity in a rare and concentrated way to connect to God, and this is a forbidden opportunity to waste. Sylvia Dahari and Tammy Perlman suggest that praying during labor and delivery is a way to speak to God directly. They showed that the letters of the word for birth in Hebrew, Leida, can be separated to write Liad Hashem, or next to God. I've written that in Hebrew on the slide here. I apologize for those who are not able to read the Hebrew. The authors say that birth, therefore, is an opportunity to be next to God in prayer. This is the reality of the ability of very high prayers. One woman writes, everything we pray will be received. Alana Berenson wants women to think of themselves as vessels for God during labor because women bring blessings to this world on behalf of God. Quote, we are partners in something holy. At this time, we have to partner in this activity with God and not let any barriers interfere with that. These authors emphasize that pregnant women have direct connections to God, which allows them to bypass rabbinic authority. Women's authority, they claim, resides in their embodiment of the divine ability to reproduce. Rabbis, authoritative because of the books they have mastered, are irrelevant here. Many of the authors in this anthology also point to the Haredi understanding that pregnancy and labor for a woman parallel exile and redemption for the Jewish people. Clarifying a complex rabbinic teaching, Bracha Tverdovich writes, babies before pregnancy are like the nation of Israel in the time of exile. The moment of labor symbolizes the moment of redemption. Tverdovich continues to explain that a woman's good deeds during pregnancy, like the Jewish people's good deeds during exile, will lead to the redemption. The stage of exile, she writes, is the stage of preparation and growth for the arrival of the Messiah. In other words, women, like the Jewish people in exile, are not just supposed to wait for someone else to bring about a healthy baby. Instead, pregnancy is the critical stage in the future development of the baby. Every change in environment, diet can influence the fetus for better or for worse. This language of exile and redemption and the parallels the authors draw with pregnancy and birth not only elevates the physicality of a woman's experience by framing it in religious terms, but it also reminds women that they play a significant role in fetal development and the healthy birth of a baby. Haredi women expressed these ideas in the way they rejected rabbinic and medical advice and simultaneously bolstered their own connection to God and thus authority over pregnancy. And I'm just bringing a few examples here from the women I spoke to. Hila, who was pregnant with her 6th child when we spoke about her rejecting medical advice, expresses the belief that pregnancy is the embodiment of divine authority. She explained, God gave me this baby and I have to provide for it and I have to take care of it. I am raising a child in me that's not only a child, but a Jewish child. Hila and other Haredi women view their bodies as direct gifts from God, a gift endowed with great responsibility because of the religious identity of this future child. This responsibility is also what sanctions Hila's authority. Because God has trusted her with this responsibility, in other words, Hila has moral authority and does not need to trust anybody else to tell her what to do with her pregnancy. The embodiment of pregnancy allows Hila to work directly with God without the need for rabbinic intermediaries. Moriah, who is a doula with 5 children of her own, emphasizes that it is through the physical act of pregnancy and childbirth that women can reach God. In fact, Moriah rejects the normalization of modesty that we can see in the pregnancy advice books. She thinks that women focus too much on remaining modest in the birthing room or saying the correct psalm during birth. She wants them to look at pregnancy and birth as a gift from God and thus imbued with an opportunity for building a relationship. She told me in this great kind of attitude, she was so worked up and frustrated with women who felt they needed to conform to every particular law. So she said to me, "You're so religious. You say blessings all the time. Start seeing God. God gave this to you. Know that. Trust that. Let him talk to you. It's a very physical experience, but it's a paradigm for life. We have a spiritual goal for it. We can rise above the physical and touch the other side." She encourages women to feel as if their bodies are not problematic, but rather the pathway toward religious authority. For Moriah, modesty is a religious ideal that does not help women see that birth is already imbued with religious significance. Instead of remaining modest, Moriah requests that Haredi women remember that the ability to birth is a direct gift from God. And as such, it is a physical experience that transcends the material realities and requirements. Here, Moriah is calling on Haredi women to use their reproductive literacy as a foil to rabbinic literacy. Maya also understands pregnancy to be the performance of God's work and therefore as something that supersedes the law. This is because pregnancy allows women to connect with God in a way that men cannot. She was 6 months pregnant with her 4th child when she talked with me about pregnancy as an opportunity to connect with God. Maya's reflections on a woman's connection to God during pregnancy and labor bolstered her views on the irrelevance of rabbinic legal rulings for pregnant women. Not only is the Talmud outdated on issues related to pregnancy, Maya claimed, but the rabbis know nothing about pregnancy and birth. Now, of course, Maya didn't know that the rabbis don't possess basic information about reproduction, although maybe that's true for some of them, but rather that their bodies have not been imbued with significance by God, as a woman's pregnant body has. This intimate relationship expressed through a woman's body gives women authority over pregnancy and birth, an authority that the rabbis simply do not possess. So the fact that women connect with God through their bodies should, according to Maya, teach women that they should rely on their rabbinic literacy. Maya explained that relying on one's body is closer to what God wants from us than what one may find in a book. Sarcastically, she insisted, "You trust doctors, you trust medicine, you trust everybody, but you don't trust yourself. Trust anybody because they went to school and they learned. Don't trust yourself, even though you've lived in your body for 20 years. Relying on one's body for knowledge during pregnancy is, for Maya, relying on God." Okay. I'm gonna stop sharing and then I'm gonna just explore this last kind of question that I raised at the beginning of why keep the books. Now, despite the authority granted to them by multiple pregnancies, women display these books alongside their husbands' books. And yet the women I spoke to who already had at least 3 children claimed not to have learned anything from these books. If this is the case, why did their descriptions of embodying divine authority sound so much like the writings in Hachana Ruchanit L'Leida? And how did they know how to navigate between medical and religious authorities, just like B'Shat Tovah told them? Furthermore, if they've not learned anything from these books, why do they hold such a prominent place on their bookshelves, sitting among their husbands' holy books? And I think I have a few answers. One of the most central elements of women's reproductive authority is their experience of embodying pregnancy. Although women in their first or second pregnancies may turn to books or external authorities, women in later pregnancies come to rely on their previous experiences. It's precisely because pregnancy happens in their bodies and not their rabbis' bodies that they understand themselves to be the authoritative sources on pregnancies. While women have come to internalize the themes popular in these pregnancy advice books, citing these books would negate the authority of the experience they gained from the embodiment of pregnancy. Instead of prioritizing book knowledge, women prioritize their embodied knowledge of pregnancy. Furthermore, citing the books would validate men's method of being Haredi as superior. It would further prop up the yeshiva world and book learning. And because books symbolize the entire authority structure in the Haredi world, wherein rabbinic leaders determine the norms and actions of adherents, referring to content from these pregnancy advice books would lend justification to the idea that these women should be visiting a rabbi every time they have a question. Instead, women prefer to rely on their own experience of pregnancy. Having these books, however, and displaying them on their shelves alongside their husband's Sfarim make it possible for them to subvert Haredi norms. As objects, these books provide the veneer of conformity and respect for Haredi authority. By appearing to conform to Haredi male norms, women are able to authoritatively and safely reject these same rules and expectations. Having the books, therefore, paves the way for women's embodied authority. Importantly, as women prioritize their embodied knowledge, they reverse the directionality of the relationship between books and babies. Recall that books, when used symbolically in skulot about fetal positions and the timing of the birth, are thought to influence the pregnancy. Additionally, male authority figures expect women to follow the instructions contained within the books and the advice of those who know the content of the books. In relying on their embodied experiences to determine whether they turn to the books for either content or symbolism, Haredi women are demonstrating that the relationship flows in the opposite direction as well. Women recognize that without their contributions, namely pregnancy, birth, and child rearing, Haredi society cannot continue. Without more children to fill the study halls, the yeshiva as an institution would be obsolete. The way they make pregnancy decisions demonstrate that the books are not directing Haredi life, but rather that the creation of life in the Haredi world makes the books relevant. As women keep their colorful books on their husbands' shelves, they're attempting to balance the scales of Haredi life and demonstrate that the bodies that create babies are on equal footing with the instructions within the books. So I'm gonna wrap up there, and let's talk.
Great. Well, I'm Jonathan Sarna. I direct the Schusterman Center, and I've been busily trying to put some of these questions together. I think the overwhelming sense is everybody wishes more. In other words, pushing questions in other directions. So, for example, there were a variety of questions seeking to understand, are there differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Haredi ultra-Orthodox women, between Hasidim and Mitnagdim? Are there differences between Israel and the diaspora? Are there differences? So a lot of chances to kind of break this down. And the last are there differences between books in Yiddish, which we didn't talk about, and books in Hebrew? So Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Hasidim, Misnagdim, Israel diaspora, Yiddish, Hebrew, but any other disaggregation that you may be interested in providing.
That's a great question. So, okay, so all of the women I spoke to were Ashkenazi. I did not speak to any Sephardi women, so I can't answer that question. But there are I have some colleagues who are this field of really talking to Haredi women about reproduction is expanding significantly right now. I recommend the work of Leah Tarragon-Zeller, who writes wonderfully about her research with religious women and reproduction. Ben Castan has a book that just came out about partially about reproduction among women in the UK. So you'll get a lot of kind of differentiation there. So the women I spoke to were all Ashkenazi. I did not notice a significant difference between those who were Hasidic and those who were Misnagdic. The big differences I noticed are, number one, the sort of shift that happens between their second pregnancy and their third pregnancy, in terms of that difference that I talked about a lot in the talk. Also, women who grew up Haredi versus women who became Haredi later in life. Women who became Haredi later in life have a much different relationship to religious authority. They are much more inclined to go to their rabbi all the time with questions. They feel much less, freedom is a terrible word, but they feel much less freedom to kind of do things on their own. Also, women who struggled with infertility. There were a few women that I spoke to at different stages of the research who struggled with infertility, and I ended up not including them in the study because their relationship to reproduction and to their bodies is so different. They're much, and this actually, anthropologists who research infertility write about this a lot, that women who struggle with infertility have are much less comfortable in their bodies, have a lot more doubt about their bodies. And, when I was finding that Haredi women who did not struggle with infertility relied on their bodies so much, that's really a significant difference. And, also, right, so that's another set of differences. The American Israeli, I think my wonderful colleague, Dr. Kara Rock-Singer, oh, you raised this question. I thought you were going to give me an answer. So all the women that I spoke to about their pregnancies were Israeli born. The women who I interviewed as doulas, most of them were American born. And there's a fascinating, kind of conversation to be had about the role of doulas in among Israeli Haredim. They're bringing this really interesting, kind of like American feminism, Ina May Gaskin's Reproductive Lives kind of thing, if people are familiar with Ina May Gaskin, and the what's it called, The Farm. But anyway, I'm digressing. I really wanted to look at women who, and to think with women who did not have trouble getting pregnant. It's part of this move to look at what's terribly termed normal pregnancy, because there's been a lot of research about infertility among women in Israel. Susan Kahn's now 20-year-old book is still considered foundational in the field about infertility and how women struggle with infertility in Israel. And there's been a lot of really great work also done about women in America with infertility, and about fertility treatments in general in the larger research on the anthropology of reproduction, not specifically about Jews. And I was following some other colleagues who had been doing work on just what is pregnancy like, actually. Like, let's just get down to the basics of pregnancy. So there are noticeable differeses between those who struggled with infertility and those who didn't, between America and Israel. America and Israel, Haredim in general, there are lots and lots of differences. There are differences in those who grew up Haredi and those who didn't. Yeah, I'm not sure I answered that question. I think I went all over the place.
Actually, there were a lot of questions about infertility, and
okay.
You really kind of answered that. We had a few questions about what happens later. In other words, you gained all of this agency, you reach 50, how does that shape Haredi women in their post-reproductive years?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one thing I think one of the things my scholarship adds to the conversation is the fact that this notion of agency is really time specific. It comes out, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. It comes out, after 2 or 3 pregnancies, and then it's only with regard to reproductive issues. It's not like while she's pregnant, she can make a decision about things having nothing to do with pregnancy. It only has to do with reproductive issues. So as soon as she's done reproducing, that sense of authority, religious authority, just kind of disappears. And it's a number of women spoke to me about how sad they felt during the birth. Not because yes, it's painful, but more because it meant that their unique relationship to God was ending for the time being, and how much they looked forward to getting pregnant again, so that they could have that sense of embodied authority once again. So in the larger Haredi world, one of the problems that happens after they turn 50 is that there's so much emphasis put on Haredi women reproducing that they kind of forget that they need medical care after they go through menopause. I worked for a number of months. I volunteered with them, doing some participant observation, but mostly not much of it went in the book in the end. But doing some research with this group called Bishvilaich, which works to normalize and give access to Haredi women who are post-reproductive years. There was some research that was concluded while I was conducting research from 2009 to 2011 on the rate of mortality from breast cancer among Haredi women, and the fact that it's much, much higher. Mortality from breast cancer is much higher among Haredi women than among the rest of the Israeli population. And that's because they're detecting it much later, because they're not getting regular exams after menopause, because it kind of falls off. Now, remember that even after menopause, Haredi women may have a few young children at home, often have a few young children at home. They're also, likely immediately grandparents. So they're working. Somebody asked about differences between Haredi women and American Haredi women, is that Haredi women are working full time. It's hard to get them to doctor appointments, and when nobody's prioritizing their health after menopause, because for all of the terrible reasons you can fill in the blank, nobody's prioritizing their health, they have this higher rate of mortality from breast cancer. And so this organization that I worked with, Bishvilaich, helps give women comprehensive health care so they can get all sorts of checkups in one place. Which is very, very helpful to very busy Haredi women. And they also work with the rabbinic authorities in the Haredi world to help promote the importance of getting that kind of medical care. And so they have a variety of, they were doing monthly seminars at the time that I was there, and inviting Haredi women to come, and they would have these recorded messages from Haredi rabbis that, talked about the importance of visiting the doctor and taking care of your health. Now, it's all framed in Haredi norm language. So we need you to take care of everybody. And so your health needs to be primary. But from a part of my background is in medical ethics. And, so I'm kind of the attitude of whatever you need to do to get it to work, get people to the doctor and get that preventative care. And they found that it really did. Within a few months, they had women making appointments, and they would go then with these mobile units into Haredi communities around Jerusalem, and get people either, mobile mammograms or get them signed up for medical care. So the situation wasn't great. That was 10 years ago, though. So I imagine that now it's hopefully a little bit better. But they were definitely aware of that problem, sort of post-menopause. How do we get these women into medical facilities? It's a great question.
We had a few questions that basically seem to be asking, what about other women authority figures? For example, nurses, Rebbitzins, parents, and grandparents. And to what extent do women turn to these other kinds of women authority figures?
Yeah, another great question. I'll deal with each of them differently. Nurses, I interviewed a number of medical representatives as part of this research, and doctors and nurses and doulas, as I mentioned. There are a number of nurses who service the community and are either Haredi themselves or kind of Haredi adjacent. And they serve as really helpful go-betweens, and they help, in other words, translate some of the instructions from the doctors. They help even in kind of telling women, okay, which rabbi do you need to go to for an answer about this? Or, you know, who do you usually go to? This is what he's told women in the past. I wouldn't go to him if you don't want that answer. That kind of information is really, really helpful. I also attended a few of the prenatal classes that the nurses run, and the nurses run these specialized prenatal classes just for Haredi women, and some of the information they're providing is just basic sex ed stuff. So they really come off as folks who are fluent in the medical language and fluent in the Haredi language, and that therefore is really helpful in a way that and they don't actually, the women spoke to me very positively about the nurses. Doctors get a bad rap because they're often cooperating with the rabbis in a way that the nurses are not. Nurses were overwhelmingly female, and so that might have been part of the difference. But the doctors come off as cooperating with whatever the rabbis want them to do in a way that the nurses don't. So that's the nurses. The nurses definitely help the women. Rebbitzins are often seen as just extensions of their husbands. So one story that I often tell is that I was walking out of a clinic with a woman who had just gotten an ultrasound, and she was walking out with the little pictures that she got at the end of the ultrasound, and she was admiring them. We had kind of exited, we were looking at them together, and she saw her Rebbitzin across the street, and she quickly stuffed the pictures into her purse. And I asked her, I mean, she crumpled them. These are the pictures that a second ago she was like admiring, and she crumpled them and stuffed them into her purse. And we walked away very, very quickly. And she asked me, you know, do you think she saw me? I said, I don't know. I don't think so. She didn't call across the street or anything, but she was very nervous that her Rebbitzin was going to tell her husband that she had gotten an ultrasound because her husband does not support ultrasounds. So this became a very, something I then started asking women a lot. Do you go to your Rebbitzin for this kind of advice? And a couple of them said that they might ask their Rebbitzin something like, what does your husband generally think about X? And from there, they'd get an answer from her, you know, that told them either he's a safe person to go to. She was kind of like a gatekeeper in that way, right? He's a safe person to go to, or don't go to him if you don't want that answer. And in that way, it was somewhat of a way to get an answer without having to officially ask, because once she's officially asked, she feels more beholden to the answer or to follow the answer. So this way she could kind of test the waters without actually answering. But if the Rebbitzin found out that she did something contrary to rabbinic instruction, that could have serious implications for her family, for herself, for all those in her orbit. So the Rebbitzins are kind of here and there. In terms of other family members, the problem is there's been a significant generational shift where even some women spoke to me about their younger sisters who were 10 years younger and how differently they related to pregnancy and in terms of asking a rabbi for advice than they did. And so between mothers and daughters, even though it may only be 20 years, there were significant changes. This is how fast, I mean, most people see the Haredim and think they're kind of eternal and they're kind of caught in a snapshot of time. And there's actually a great deal of changing going on. And this is just one of those ways. So their mothers, they said their mothers would never imagine making a decision without asking the rabbi. But you know, that they've kind of shifted in their thinking about that. When it comes to their friends, this was something that really surprised me and just made me very sad. They're very afraid that their friends are going to judge them, or that their friends will tell their husbands, oh, look at Sarah down the street. Sarah got an ultrasound, or Sarah is going to get an epidural for birth, or Sarah, I don't know, whatever it is. And they're concerned that that they're not all talking to each other about how they're making these decisions, and what kinds of decisions they're making. And it's why in the end, I mean, I was giving talks about this a while ago, and I always got that question, don't they talk to their friends? Maybe that's where they're getting this kind of, you know, they're getting these ideas that they can make these decisions on their own. And, you know, they insisted they were too terrified to speak to their friends, because of what their friends might say about them. And that's when I really started turning to the pregnancy books and pregnancy advice books, because I had collected them while I was doing research, and I didn't look at them initially, because the women said they weren't important. And so I didn't look at them. And then once I kept getting this question, where are they getting this sense of embodiment from, this sense of authority, the sense of connection to God? And I found it within the books. You know, that was kind of a real light bulb moment for me.
Great. Well, since you referred to the friends of Sarah, but in your talk, you tended to use more modern names that led some of our social science types here to wonder about your sample. The names that you used are not standard Haredi names, which tend to be more biblical. They're modern Israeli. They wanted to know about that, and some wanted to know other things about the sample. How many are so-called from birth? How many, in other words, are born into the Haredi world? How many not? Did you privilege Anglo-Saxons? I wonder if you can talk about some of those issues.
Yeah. So let's see. So all the women that I spoke to are Israeli. All the pregnant, the women that I spoke to about their pregnancies are all Israeli. They grew up in Israel. They were born in Israel. They are, what are the other questions? In terms of the names, you know, this is something that I was thinking about a lot, because so there are a lot of other names. I use a lot of other names in the book, but you know, there was a big conversation I had with folks, because my book is angled not just towards Jewish studies, but towards religious studies broadly. And I really wanted it to have a kind of, I wanted it to be accessible to folks outside of Jewish studies. So I wanted the names to be a little more familiar in that way, or at least readable, pronounceable. So that guided a lot of how I chose the names. But the whole sample of women who I interviewed about pregnancy are Israeli from origin. They're from birth. They are, almost all of them worked at least part-time, if not full-time. And they all had at least 3 children. Most of the husbands were kollel husbands who studied in yeshiva. And they all of the women lived in one of the Haredi communities in Jerusalem.
Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time. There were many other questions, and I apologize we didn't get to them. I know I speak for everyone when I thank you for really a fascinating seminar and talk. I'm sure that you will sell many copies of your book among
Thank you.
those
You can
who
buy it on, You can buy it on Bookshop or Barnes and Noble or Amazon if you prefer. This has been lovely. If you have questions that I didn't get to, I'm happy. You can email me and I will answer. You can find my email at rutgers.edu.
Well, thank everybody. I want to thank you for joining us and invite you to join us again for other programs that we sponsor. You can find all of them listed at our Schusterman website. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.